think next year when we run away money, we'll let them act out the parts. We were close to it today, so maybe next year we can all act it out. So in the beginning of his book, Gates of the Forest, Elie Wiesel recounts a story. The story is about a rabbi by the name of Baal Shem Tov. Now, Baal Shem Tov, it is said, whenever there was a calamity approaching the people, a tragedy that was about to befall them, Baal Shem Tov would go out into the forest to a special holy place. Baal Shem Tov in that special holy place would light a sacred fire. And after lighting the sacred fire, he would recite just the right words of a sacred, holy prayer. And a miracle would be accomplished. The tragedy would be averted, and the people would be saved. Later, a disciple of Baal Shem Tov was there to serve. And when tragedy came once more to the people, this disciple went out into the forest. And he found the holy place, but he couldn't remember how to light the sacred fire. But still, he said the words to the sacred holy prayer. The tragedy was averted, a miracle was accomplished, and the people were saved. The rabbi of the next generation, it becomes his turn to intervene to heaven on behalf of the people. But this rabbi goes out to the sacred holy place in the forest, but when he gets there, he says to God, I don't know how to light the fire. I don't know the words of the sacred prayer. I can only find this holy place. And a miracle was accomplished. Tragedy was averted. The people were saved. And then when the great-grandson of Rabbi Baal Shem Tov's first disciple became a rabbi, and tragedy was befalling the people, the new rabbi sat in his armchair, dropped his head into his hands, and said, "Oh Lord, I cannot light the sacred fire. I do not know the words to the holy prayer. I can't even find the holy place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story. It must be sufficient." And Elie Wiesel says, it was sufficient. Every community has traditions. Every family has traditions. And sometimes, for a variety of reasons, traditions start to change. So it's Mother's Day, and I'll bet anything some of y'all have traditions on Mother's Day. Right? Sure. Come to church with Mom. Had a good friend once who came to church twice a year. It was on Easter and Mother's Day. And so that's how you can set your calendar. Until one day he came in with neither one, and I was completely confused. Oh, we have Memorial Day coming up. You have traditions on Memorial Day? Things that you do every year associated with that holiday? You're not saying you do, but I bet you do. Everybody's got traditions. In our family, growing up, when around the holidays, we would go to different people's homes on the specific holidays. And for us, in my immediate family, Thanksgiving was the holiday that my mother loved to host. On Thanksgiving, all the family would come to our house. They would come to our house, and we would have turkey and dressing and giblet gravy. We would have sweet potato casserole. We would have a frozen cranberry salad, the green bean dish with all the fried onions on top, right? And we'd even get those rolls that had like the three or four sections in them. You put in the oven, you put a pat of butter on them, and they were just delicious. That was our traditional Thanksgiving feast. Well then, a few years later, Thanksgiving, one time, I'm eating that frozen cranberry salad that had been made by one of the elder members of our family, and I found a key ring in my piece of the salad. So we stopped having frozen cranberry salad. Another year, there was just a little bit too much bourbon in the sweet potato casserole, so we stopped having sweet potato casserole. And as time went on, as people moved away, passed away, the tradition changed. And even one Thanksgiving, not too long ago, for our Thanksgiving tradition, our feast was a fish fry. But it was still our Thanksgiving tradition. Traditions can change, sometimes subtly, without us even realizing it. Well, that's a bit of what's going on in this passage in Acts 15. There's a community of people, and their traditions might be about to change. So we have to kind of talk about what's happening here. So if you remember, if you were here last week, Tara spoke about Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. The week before, we talked about Stephen when he became a deacon and when he became the first martyr in the church, when he was stoned to death. Well, when Stephen was stoned to death in Jerusalem, as you can imagine, this shook up many of the believers in Jerusalem. And as a result of this, some of the leaders of the way in Jerusalem fled. They went out from Jerusalem to get away from what was going on. And they went to places like Antioch. Some of the leaders that left Jerusalem landed in Antioch. Well, in whatever city these people from the way went to, they would go there and they would preach in the synagogues only to the Jews. So you have to remember, at this time, the church is Jewish. At this time, the followers of the way are just about all Jewish. They are Jewish to the point that the only difference between them and all the other Jews is that they accept Jesus as the Messiah. And the Jewish people are not necessarily known for their desire to convert people. I was sitting on a panel one time of world religion, and the rabbi was sitting next to me, and he said that when someone comes to him and wants to join, his response is always, when they come to him and say, Rabbi, I want to become a Jew, he says, go and read the Torah, study for a year, and then come back and we'll talk. Could you imagine what y'all would think of me if someone came up to me and said, Reverend Land, I want to join the church? And I would say, here's the book of confessions, go and study, come back in a year, and then we'll talk. It's not typical, is it? But in the Jewish tradition, conversion wasn't that big of a deal. So it was no wonder that they were speaking only to the Jews. But somehow or another in Antioch, non-Jews heard the word. Gentiles heard the word. Gentiles heard the word, and the word of the Lord was rampant in that place. And a great many Gentiles joined the numbers of the followers of the way. Well, word of this exciting movement among the Gentiles in Antioch traveled all the way back to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the center of Christianity at this time, you could say. The center of the church. The center of the believers. That's where the leadership was. And so they sent someone to Antioch to investigate, to see what was going on. They sent Barnabas to Antioch. Barnabas gets to Antioch and he is amazed by what is happening there. He is amazed by the people who are responding to the word, how their numbers are growing day by day. And so Barnabas then goes to Tarsus. And there in Tarsus he finds Saul. And he grabs Saul and says, come with me and see what they're doing in Antioch. And Barnabas and Saul lived and ministered in Antioch for a year. And it was during this time, during this year of ministry in Antioch, when all this was happening among the Gentiles, it was at this time that the believers were first known as Christians. There was exciting things happening. But some of the believers, the Jewish believers, believed that these new converts, these Gentiles, had to hold to the same practices of all of the Jews. Had to hold to those practices of circumcision, dietary regulations, all of it, in order to become true followers of the way. Well, Paul and Barnabas obviously disagreed, and so they left Antioch to go to Jerusalem to take it up with the establishment, to take it up with the leadership, and see what might happen to their traditions as more people came into the community. So if you're going to think about what's happening in the church at this time, you have to realize that Jerusalem is the center. Okay? So Jerusalem is, I said okay, like hoping y'all would nod and follow along with me. Yeah? Okay. So Jerusalem is the center of this movement. It is where the leadership of this movement live. It is from here that they find out what's happening as the word spreads. Antioch, way out on the fringe, way away from the center of the movement, on the edges of the movement, on the frontier of the movement, you might say. There was an article in Forbes by a guy named Tim O'Reilly that says that it talks about where innovation happens. And in his case, he's specifically talking about innovation with technology, with computers, with software design. And he says that the common thought is that innovation happens in these large businesses in Silicon Valley, these places that can afford to fund huge think tanks. But he says the opposite is actually the truth. He says innovation happens with, now this is his term, so don't get mad at me for saying it. Innovation happens with alpha geeks, okay? Those people who use technology and want it to do more. And so they adapt the technology to do more of what it can possibly do, to do what they need it to do. The World Wide Web was started by an Englishman who worked for a huge Swedish physics lab. The lab was so big they had a hard time communicating, and to make communication easier, that's how the World Wide Web began. The first personal computers. Computers were started by some hobbyists in a garage, some hobbyists known as the Homebrew Computer Club. They were not part of the establishment. They were on the fringes of everything that was going on. Now granted, some of those people went on to found huge companies, but still, it was on the edges, on the fringes, on the outskirts where innovation happened. Is anybody here a Trekkie? Does anybody here know what I mean when I say Trekkie? You got some? Alright, so Star Trek, right? I know that some of the kids who went to Kid Quake the other week, I know they learned the Energizer that goes to the song Star Trekkin', which is, by the way, the only Energizer I do, but we're not doing that now, don't worry. But I have a theory about why so many people love Star Trek. People love Star Trek because it's about space, the final frontier. About people who boldly go where no man or woman has ever been before. You see, it's out there on the horizon, out there in the unknown where adventure and excitement happens. I'm also a huge fan of Westerns. Anyone else? I also have a theory. Okay, so you know if you're a fan of Westerns, the iconic final scene of a Western is the hero riding off into the sunset, right? So Westerns take place in the American West. The sun sets in the West. The hero is riding off into the unknown West, the wild West, looking for the next adventure, looking for the next bit of excitement, looking for the next innovation. Adventure, excitement, innovation, these things happen on the edges. So, Barnabas and Paul are bringing news of this innovation, news of this excitement from the edges, from Phoenicia and Samaria, and they make it to Jerusalem, and there is a debate. Do we make these Gentiles be like us Jewish believers, or do we let them come in on their own? Now you have to think the prevailing thought would have been that the people in the center, the leadership who had a certain way of doing things, they would be the ones that say, no, you have to be like us. But they didn't. They made room. They saw the exciting things that God and the Holy Spirit were doing on the edges, on the frontier, on the outskirts. And they made room for these fringe believers in their midst. In the 2 verses following what we read, it tells exactly what the new believers had to do. There are 4 requirements that they had to do, and it's just important to know that in those requirements, they're not required to be Jewish. They're required, as all Gentiles are required in Leviticus, to do certain things so that they can live among other Jewish people. The people in the center made room for those on the edge. Not only did the people in the center make room for those on the edge made room for those in the center. You know, Paul and Barnabas could have easily given up. Could have easily said, you know what? Forget about it. Y'all do you, we'll do us. We're going to go back out here where everything's happening. But they didn't. And again, the center could have simply said, why is this even a discussion? This is just the way things are. Now get in line. But they didn't. They made room for one another. Tradition and new tradition came together in that space. People on the fringe realized that they needed the people at the center. They needed their history. They needed their knowledge and their tradition. The people in the center knew that they needed the people in the fringe. They needed their excitement and their fervor for God. Each made space for the other. So this week I got interviewed by a young man who was working on a paper, and he asked me the question. He said, how do you think the church should respond to millennials? Now, millennials is that catchphrase for the generation of people that are just a little bit younger than me. Basically, the young adults in our society who are starting a career, who are maybe married, maybe they have children. How do we respond to millennials? Because millennials do things differently than we had ever done before. Well, I think the answer is simple. The church has to make room for them. The church has to make room for their busy lifestyles. The church has to make room for families where everyone works. The church has to make room for rambunctious children. The church has to make room for mobile lifestyles that hardly ever find somebody at home on the weekends, much less in the same place one week after the other. The church needs to make room. And we should do that because they're on the edges. That's where the excitement is happening. We can learn from their excitement, from their energy, from their mobility, and they need to make space for us as well because they need our tradition, our words of how we connect with God. It happened in Jerusalem. The establishment made room for the fringe, and the fringe made room for the establishment. It can happen again. We just make room for one another. Amen?